You ever notice how sometimes the biggest, boldest bets in business can totally flip on their heads? I mean, we all love a good underdog story, right? But what about when the giant, the one everyone's watching, the one who seems to have it all figured out, suddenly stumbles? That's the kind of thing that's been on my mind lately, especially with what's going on over in China with electric cars. It's wild, honestly. You'd think, with all the headlines about China taking over the EV world, that they'd be cruising along, right? But man, the reality is turning out to be a whole lot messier and honestly way more interesting than anyone expected. So here's what caught my attention. China's been on this absolute tear to become the king of electric vehicles. For years, they've been pumping money, energy, and hype into making sure that if you think electric car, you think made in China. And for a while, it looked like they were pulling it off. I mean, you had companies like BYD, maybe you've seen their name pop up in the news, just cranking out cars, selling them at prices that made everyone else sweat. Tesla, Ford, Volkswagen, you name it, they were all looking over their shoulders, wondering how they were going to keep up. But here's the twist. Instead of this turning into a victory lap, it's starting to look like a cautionary tale. Like, you know when you're watching a movie and the hero gets a little too confident and you just know something's about to go sideways. That's the vibe I'm getting from what's happening in China's EV world right now. And hey, before I get too deep into this, if you're into stories about how the world really works, business, tech, the stuff that's shaping our lives, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I love digging into these big, messy stories, and I'd love to have you all along for the ride. All right, back to China and their electric car gamble. Let's set the scene for a second. Imagine you're at a massive car show, right? Every booth is lit up. Every company is showing off their latest, shiniest electric car. There's excitement in the air. People are buzzing about the future. That's kind of been the mood in China for the past few years. The government's all in, pouring billions into subsidies, building charging stations everywhere, making sure people have every reason to ditch gas and go electric. And then you've got BYD, which is kind of like the Tesla of China, but even bigger in some ways. These guys are everywhere. They make batteries, they make cars, they even make the buses that shuttle people around the city.
BYD's been leading the charge, and they decided to go for broke. Their big move? Cut prices. Not just a little, but a lot. Like, let's make these cars so cheap that nobody can say no kind of cheap. At first, it seemed genius. Sales shot up. People who couldn't afford an EV before suddenly could. Other companies panicked. Tesla, which had been the cool kid on the block, started slashing prices too, just to keep up. And then it was like dominoes, one company after another, all dropping their prices, trying not to get left behind. But here's where things get tricky. You ever been to a Black Friday sale where the deals are so good people are practically wrestling each other for flat-screen TVs? It's chaos, right? Well, that's kind of what happened in China's EV market, except instead of TVs, it was cars. And instead of people fighting over bargains, it was companies fighting over who could survive selling cars for less and less money. Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't that good for customers? Cheaper cars, more choices? And yeah, at first it was. But then the cracks started to show. See, when everyone's cutting prices just to keep up, nobody's really making money. In fact, some of these companies were losing money on every car they sold. Imagine running a business where the more you sell, the more you lose. That's not a recipe for long-term success. And it wasn't just the car companies feeling the heat. The whole ecosystem started wobbling. Suppliers, the people who make the seats, the dashboards, the little chips that make everything work, suddenly weren't getting paid on time. Dealerships, which are already a tough business, started going under. In some provinces, BYD's own dealerships just shut their doors because they couldn't keep up with the losses. It gets even crazier. Some companies, desperate to move cars, started doing this thing where they'd sell brand new cars as used, just to get around certain rules or to make the numbers look better. So you'd have these zero-mileage second-hand cars flooding the market. And what happens when there are too many cars and not enough buyers? Prices drop even more, And suddenly, if you bought a new car, it was worth way less the minute you drove it off the lot. Not exactly the dream scenario for anyone hoping their shiny new EV would hold its value. And let's talk about quality for a second. When you're slashing prices and everyone's scrambling to survive, something's got to give.
Some companies started cutting corners. Maybe not on the stuff you see right away, but on things like safety features, after-sales service, that kind of thing. It's like when you buy a cheap pair of shoes that look great in the store, but then the sole falls off after a week. Not ideal, especially when we're talking about something as important as a car. Meanwhile, the government's watching all this play out, and they're not exactly thrilled. They wanted to build a world-class industry, something they could be proud of, something that would make made in China mean quality and innovation. Instead, they're seeing headlines about bankrupt dealerships, unpaid suppliers, and cars that are worth less than a used laptop the minute you buy them. So what do? They try to step in. They tell the companies, hey, maybe cool it with the price wars. Stop selling cars for less than they cost to make. But here's the thing. BYD is so big, and the market's gotten so wild, that it's not easy to just put the brakes on. It's like trying to stop a runaway train with a stop sign. And then there's the export angle. For a while, China was looking at the rest of the world and thinking, hey, if we can't sell all these cars here, let's send them overseas. And they did. Europe, Southeast Asia, even Russia. But now other countries are starting to push back. The US market is basically off limits. Japan and South Korea are talking about new rules to keep Chinese cars out. Even Russia, which used to be a big customer, isn't as reliable as it used to be. So those easy wins are drying up fast. Let's pause for a second and think about what this all means. It's not just about cars. It's about what happens when a country, and not just any country, but the world's second biggest economy, bets big on an industry and then hits a wall. It's about what happens when the race to the bottom gets so intense that nobody wins. And it's about how sometimes the very thing that made you successful, being aggressive, taking risks, moving fast, can turn around and bite you. I keep coming back to this image of a poker table. You know, everyone's got their chips, and China's sitting there with this massive stack, pushing all in on electric cars. For a while, it looks like they're going to clean up. But then the cards start turning over, and suddenly it's not so clear who's going to walk away with the pot. And here's where it gets even more interesting. There are people inside China, industry veterans, folks who've been around the block, who are starting to sound the alarm.
They're looking at BYD and saying, hey, we've seen this movie before. Remember Evergrande, that giant real estate company that went from being on top of the world to collapsing under its own debt? Some people are starting to wonder if BYD could be heading down a similar path. Now, to be clear, BYD isn't about to disappear overnight. They're still huge. But the numbers are starting to look scary. Their real debt, if you count all the creative ways they've been borrowing and delaying payments, might be as high as $45 billion. That's a lot of money, even for a company their size. And when you combine that with factories running at half capacity, suppliers going out of business, and a shrinking export market, you start to see why people are getting nervous. One of the things that really stands out to me is how quickly things can change. A couple of years ago, everyone was talking about how China was going to dominate the EV world. Now the conversation is about how they're going to survive this mess. It's a reminder that in business, as in life, nothing is guaranteed. You can have the best plan, the most money, the smartest people, and still run into trouble if you're not careful. And you know what? There's a lesson here for everyone. Not just car companies or governments, but anyone who's ever tried to build something big. It's about balance, about knowing when to push and when to pull back, about understanding that sometimes going too fast can be just as dangerous as going too slow. I think about the people on the ground, the workers in the factories, the families running dealerships, the engineers trying to make these cars better and safer. For them, this isn't just a business story, it's their livelihood. When a dealership closes, that's jobs lost. When a supplier goes under, that's a whole community affected. It's easy to get caught up in the big numbers and the flashy headlines, but at the end of the day, it's real people who feel the impact. And then there's the bigger picture. What happens if this whole thing really does go off the rails? China's economy is already dealing with a bunch of other challenges: real estate, debt, slowing growth. If the EV industry, which was supposed to be a bright spot, turns into another headache, that's going to have ripple effects far beyond just cars. But here's the thing.
I wouldn't count China out just yet. They're nothing if not resilient. They've reinvented themselves before, and they might just do it again.
Maybe this crisis will force the industry to get smarter, to focus on quality instead of just quantity, to build cars that people really want and that can compete anywhere in the world, not just on price, but on value. And maybe, just maybe, this will be the moment when the rest of the world wakes up and realizes that the race for the future of cars isn't just about who can make the cheapest vehicle, but who can build something that lasts, that people love, that makes a difference. I don't know about you, but I find this whole saga fascinating. It's got everything: ambition, risk, drama, real-world consequences. It's a reminder that the future is never as simple as we think, and that even the biggest players can get caught off guard. So next time you see a headline about China's EV market, or you spot a BYD car on the road, remember, there's a whole lot more going on under the hood than meets the eye. And the story's far from over. If you're as curious about these kinds of stories as I am, don't forget to subscribe. There's always more to dig into, more twists and turns to uncover. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll catch you next time with another story that's just as wild.